So much, Melissa, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. Today's talk is using Chaos Toolkit to determine the resiliency for your web app. So, before I begin, I would like to extend a huge thank you to the team of PyCon Indonesia 2021 for putting up this wonderful event and also giving me an opportunity to present my talk. So, thank you so much. So, a brief background about me. Yes, I've been working primarily as an Android mobile developer for the past 5 plus years now, and I've been mainly involved in developing applications on cutting edge technologies like AI, AR, and VR. And I would say, apart from being passionate about technology, I also love writing poems, traveling to different places across the globe, and meeting new people. So that's about me in a nutshell. Now, they say that in life, failure is a stepping stone to success. But in the world of technology, failures can actually cause certain expensive outages to companies, right? Now, most software companies, or majority of the software companies that are there out there, they are started to use a lot of microservices, and they leverage cloud-based architectures particularly. And no longer are our systems those simple systems where you had a single front end or a single back end, right? So systems are now heterogeneous in nature, where you have to connect to multiple systems, be it like an Oracle or an SAP or any kind of technology. And systems are day by day getting more and more complicated, I would say. And if you ask me honestly, today there is even no time for a downtime. So this is how the situation is today. And which brings us to the conclusion that there is a need for us to understand how this would be solved. And for that, we need to understand something called as chaos engineering. Now, the term chaos engineering basically means that you can use chaos engineering to identify the faults in your system by running a set of controlled experiments, and that would help to bring out or identify the failures, and that would be basically done to be done as soon as possible, so that you can prevent the failures from happening in future as well. This term actually is already so popular that this came into first time into existence quite some time back, especially with the Netflix story. Now, Netflix had come up with a tool called the Chaos Monkey. Now, Chaos Monkey is again a very popular tool, which is basically to use to randomly disable certain production instances, and so that you can the failures could be visible without actually impacting the end user. So that is the main objective of using this kind of tool. And the main idea here is to plan for failure and to identify the weaknesses basically in your system through certain set of controlled experiments. So as developers, for us, we need to understand how we can apply the principles of chaos engineering, or how do we actually get started. So for that, we definitely, as developers, we would need something like a toolkit, right? So luckily we have something like that. So that is basically called as the chaos toolkit. Now, the Chaos Toolkit is also a very simple, I would say, an engineering toolkit specifically for developers, and it basically has two main objectives. Now, the first objective is to actually provide a starting point to developers to apply the principles of chaos engineering. So you could basically use the Chaos Toolkit to understand more on, first of all, the concepts of chaos engineering. And then you can actually also help, it also helps you to define certain open API to integrate with multiple systems. So if you want to integrate with other systems, you can also leverage the Chaos Toolkit. Of course, yes, it is open source. It is based on Python, and it can be extended to any system. And here, the good part is that one need not actually, try to learn any other kind of like a language or a framework, because this you can actually define your experiments using standard JSON or a YAML-based, markup language, where most developers would be familiar with. So this is how easy it is to basically, start using the Chaos Toolkit. So how do we go about writing the first experiment? So before that, we need to install, or make sure that Chaos Toolkit is installed. So Chaos Toolkit officially supports Python 3.6 and above. One can install it using a simple pip command. So all you need to do is run a simple pip command to install the latest dependency, or you could even create a virtual environment and install the specific dependency, specific version if needed. So the Chaos Toolkit is again something that would help you to get started with writing your first, I would say, chaos engineering experiment. But before we even start to write the experiment, we need to understand a very important concept in chaos engineering called as steady state hypothesis. Now, if you ask me how to define a steady state hypothesis to a normal, I would say a layman person, so a steady state is basically a state in which everything is working normally, or I would say, everything is fine. There is no issue as such. So the steady state hypothesis is something that it's mainly used, I would say, or mainly verified at two places. So one is before the experiment is running. So before you start running your experiment, you check if if the system is in the normal state, and one is actually later. So one is after you have run the experiment, you check if the system is still in the normal state. So these are the two, I would say, the two phases in which you have to determine or validate whether your system is matches the steady state hypothesis or not. So coming to the next slide, now here is a very simple experiment that could help you get started. So here is where I have defined a simple experiment in a file called the experiment.json, where I have mentioned certain mandatory parameters. So there is a title for my experiment, there is a description, specify the tags if needed, and the main part is basically the steady state hypothesis block, where you can see that I have defined a steady state hypothesis. There is something called as probes. Now probes basically is nothing but a way of observing a set of conditions for the system which is under basically experimentation. So one could actually define a probe. So in this case I have gone and defined a probe. In this case I have just checked for a tolerance of say a value 200, and this is basically because I'm doing an HTTP request. So my provider in this case is an HTTP provider, which basically tries to hit a particular URL which I have configured in the provider block itself. And so this type of configuration would basically mean that you would try to hit the URL to check if the website or the app is up and running. So this is what could be your steady state hypothesis, but then you could actually customize it based on your requirements as well. But this is like a simple example for you to understand. There is also something called as a method block. Now method basically represents a set of activities, I would say, that you would like to carry out as a part of your experiment. So these activities again can be in the form of probes, or it can be in the form of actions. So we'll be talking about it in the some coming slides as well. And finally there is something called as rollbacks, which as a term suggests, is basically to revert a particular action or to roll back to a particular state. So this is how a simple experiment would look like. So moving on to the next slide. So how do we actually go about running the experiment? So in order to basically run the experiment, you need to basically use the command kiosk run followed by the name of the experiment. So in this case, it's this command would basically run the experiment and would give you this kind of an output. So let's try this in action from the editor itself. So I'll basically move to my editor, where I have this same file present over here. So I have the experiment.json over here. So as you can see, I have already defined the title description. There is something also called as contributions. So this contributions block is basically going to be your the valuable system properties. So you might also try to specify whether your experiment, how your experiment is going to look, especially for stakeholders, how what is it going to guarantee. So in this case, I've said that reliability is going to be high. So there can be multiple values over here. You can have high, medium, or low. And if you want to say that you don't take into account security, then in that case you can specify the security as none as well. So this is basically for stakeholders to understand what your experiment is trying to kind of achieve in a way, followed by the steady state hypothesis, which we already talked about. So here is the block which I have defined. Now if I had to basically run this particular run this particular file, so I would basically use the same command which I was talking about. So let's try to run this. Okay, so once I run the particular command, you can see that it's trying to validate the experiment. So it checks the experiment syntax whether everything is fine, and then it first of all it checks for the steady state hypothesis. So it says that it is met because my Flask server is up and running. So I have the server already up and running. So it said that yes, it is able to match the steady state. And for the I have also defined a probe, where I have checked whether there is a certain response that I'm expecting. So it does return a 200 response, and that is how it says that yes, the steady state hypothesis is met. So this is how easy, or how one can start off with a simple experiment. So coming to the next part, where I also defined a probe, and I've also defined in this case a method. So I said that method basically would represent a sequence of actions. So in this case, I'm basically defining a probe, which basically tries to return a 200 response. So I'm checking whether one of my endpoints is returning a 200 with a valid JSON response. So in this case, instead of specifying status code, I have gone in with something called as a JSON path, which is also another type of tolerance, which tries to check if one of the response parameters of my API basically is having the same name. So in this case, I am checking for the name parameter in the response, and I'm expecting the value to be something like this. So this is how one can actually check if your expected value also is same or not. So just in case you're having certain APIs in that format. So this is something that one could actually also leverage in case you have multiple APIs defined and you're expecting some sort of parameters in return as well. So moving back to the presentation. So this is how one can run the experiment. So let's move on to the next slide. Now the question is, as developers, how do we actually configure this? So if I have to use this for, say, a Flask-based, my own Flask-based Python web app, or if I have to use it for another app, how do we actually configure it? So for that, I have actually come up with this kind of a checklist. So I would recommend you to maybe try out this checklist and try to configure your Chaos Toolkit based on this checklist. So there are four, I would say, steps. So the first step basically is defining your endpoints. So defining your endpoints would basically mean to define your the endpoints of the APIs in this case. So if you have already have a Flask app, you could probably, you don't need to define them. But if you trying to develop it from scratch, is here is where you could try to define certain endpoints. So I have gone in with certain dummy endpoints, which basically is to check whether there is a positive response or there is a failure response. So this is something that you could do as a first part. Moving to the next slide. So for you to actually check if your system is resilient enough, so for that you would need to also something use something called as a kiosk middleware. Now what exactly is a kiosk middleware? Now kiosk middleware basically helps you to allow, or to introduce certain failure conditions. So that is something that you need to also check, right? So you need to check if your application is how it can recover from failure. So for that, you could install this extension called the ProofDoc Kiosk Middleware Flask, which is basically again an extension which supports Python 3.5 and above. And here is where you could actually configure certain parameters. So you could configure your application name, you can specify the environment and a token in this case. And this basically middleware will help you to allow to introduce for failure conditions. So how this can be done is also something that I will tell you. So moving on to the next slide. So this kind of an extension basically helps you to introduce failure conditions by using something called as a proof doc attack. So you can pass in a header. You can pass in a custom header as a part of your request, which has that will introduce an exception. And this is where you can simulate, I would say, simulate your delays and faults. So you can also introduce a kind of a delay mechanism to check if your APIs are how they're responding in case of delays. So if you want to basically customize this, you can also do this. The proof of extension is something that you could install as well as configure in your app to simulate different kinds of faults. So this is a simple example of how you can do it. Now moving on to the next slide. So we talked about how we can actually use the proof of extension, but then there is something called as control extensions basically that helps you to do this. So in order for you to actually customize the way your experiment works, or to manage the flow of the experiment itself, you could actually come up with your own control extensions as well. So control extensions basically they help you they provide a set of functions, I would say, certain callbacks that you could basically leverage. So there are certain callbacks like before activity control or an after activity control, in which you could write or specify your custom logic to handle that particular failure. So in this case, I have actually done a very simple kind of an extension where I basically check if the JSON response basically is returns 200, and I check for a certain parameter value as well. So this is how you can actually come up with a control extension. So what is the advantage of doing or implementing a control extension is that once you run a control extension, you could actually check, if something actually, was wrong, or there is something that, that has come up unexpectedly. And here is where you could identify that as early as possible, so that, this does not become a bottleneck in the future as well. So this is one of the advantages of, developing or writing your own control extension. So let's see how this works again by going through the experiment again. So I have another experiment which I have created, which I have defined the controls block over here. So in this case, you can see that I have a control extension which is again having a provider of type Python. So this is going to be my module that I have already specified, and this is going to be having the module basically is the proof doc. So this is basically, you can find it inside the packages over here. So this basically control.py file would have all the functions that I mentioned before, and here is where you could actually configure or write your custom logic to handle the control extension. So coming back to the experiment, if I had to run this experiment, let's say in verbose mode now, so let's try to see how this would work. So for this, I would basically use the verbose command to show how the various steps that are happening as a part of the experiment. So here you can see that the experiment has started running, and it is basically now going to run the steady state hypothesis as as mentioned. And here you can see that it has actually encountered an exception. So this is basically because of the proof doc extension that I have already configured just to simulate a kind of a failure scenario. But then this could happen with any sort of API, right? So you have to basically kind of have a logic in place. So here you can see that there is the control extension has taken effect over here, where you see that the control has been loaded from the package itself. So this kind of an approach helps you to not only develop your own custom extensions, but also to identify the failure, and also to try to mitigate it in the future as well. So moving on, to in the presentation. So the next or the last part of the checklist, I would say, is to automate this overall process, right? So how do we go about automating? Because you cannot actually be running the experiment every time. So for that, one could actually leverage Docker in this case. So you could actually leverage Docker with a Python image, and where you could specify the virtual environment, the requirements of txt file, and then run the server using Docker. And once that is done, I would say you could actually go about also having a pipeline. So here is where I have leveraged, I would say, Jenkins, but then this can be extended to any CI framework out there. And this is basically an example of a stage pipeline where you have a couple of stages. So I first of all I build a Docker image, and then run the Docker container, and then followed by running the chaos experiments itself. So this is this is something that one can also leverage, and this is how it would actually eventually look. So it will be a kind of a stage pipeline where you would have some stages in terms of checking of the environment, then building the Docker, running the Docker container, and finally running the chaos experiments. So this is how you can actually go about even automating the whole process. So something that as developers we also try to do in our day-to-day lives. So coming to the end of the presentation, yes, system failures nowadays have become difficult to predict, and we need to be basically proactive and try to learn from failure as early as possible. And the objective here, or the goal, is to create a more, I would say, resilient environment. And using the Chaos Toolkit, I would say, is a good opportunity, because it can help. One can actually leverage Python to extend the Chaos Toolkit and create control extensions and many more such things to make the whole process, I would say, resilient enough. So for those of you who would like to try out the examples, I have also put down the link to download the slides and the code. So please feel free to come up with, I would say, better or innovative solutions as well in your own project. So once again, terima kasih to everyone, and especially the PyCon Indonesia team. And it was really nice being here, and hope all of you have a nice day. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Karan. And let's see. There are questions and also compliments. This first thing is There is a compliment from Ridwan Fajar Septian. Very enlightened. It will help me a lot for my day-to-day work to our infrastructure. Wow.
Oh yes, thank you, to Ridwan. Yes. So yes, so definitely, it is something that could help enterprises, especially if you are trying to build like big products, like big applications, and you have to manage them, especially in production environment. So yeah.
Okay, going to the next. There is a question from also from Ridwan. Have you tried Chaos Toolkit on production environment? If you try it,
Yes.
what's the worst impact for running chaos engineering in production?
Well, to run in production of yes. So the first part of the question is yes, I have tried it, and it was again for a Flask-based app itself. And the worst impact for running chaos engineering in production, I would say, is if your experiments start failing itself. So you have to, be a little careful also in terms of how you configure or how you write your experiments to make sure that everything is checked or everything is running in the proper manner. And the objective is to try to introduce, as I said, random behavior. So it's something that it should be unpredictable. It's something that you should use experiments to not try to introduce certain random behavior which you may not expect to happen. So that is where you can try to write your experiments in such a way so that they would help you to identify that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the explanation, Mr. Karan. And there is some more compliment again from also Ridwan after you're answering the questions. He says, thanks for the sessions, Karan. Awesome.
Thank you. So it was really nice. So also, I would wanted to suggest, like, there are many kiosk engineering toolkits out there. So like for Python specifically, there is Powerful Seal, there is Chaos Toolkit, but there are other, like, if you plan to use, say, for example, other languages, there are other, like a Chaos Mesh or a Chaos Blade. So these are also other things. But then for Python, I would say one could leverage the Chaos Toolkit or some other framework. So my experience so far has been good. So one can actually use this in their own organizations and try to, I would say, build more scalable solutions. Yeah.
Okay, there is one question again from Ivan Putra. What the worst that can happen with emoticon tongue?
The worst, as I said, the worst that could happen is if you're even everything goes, like, everything starts failing. So uh, I would say, yeah, that could also be a scenario. So if the worst that could happen would be your, even your steady state hypothesis won't be met. So the worst thing is that even your system would be not the stable enough. So that is the worst, I would say, that could happen.
Okay, there is questions again from Alfian Kurnianto. He asked about, is it compatible with framework other than Flash?
Yes, you can. I have not tried it with, say, Django or any other Python framework, but yes, I believe it should be compatible, because as long as you have your, because the experiments are written in JSON or YAML, which is pretty straightforward. And if you want to basically invoke certain endpoints, so I don't see any restriction in terms of the framework that you use. But then that is something that have to still try, but I would definitely like to try as well in the future.
Okay, I see there is no more questions again, but there is still we will still have time, guys. So if you want to ask something or yeah, say anything, you can drop it on the chat, and then yeah, I will drop it in here to Mr. Kara. So is there any question, guys? But waiting from the attendance for posting the questions, yeah, Mr. Karan. I see there it is a really interesting, yeah, using uh into your topic using the Chaos Toolkit. I never tried that. Really, honestly, I never tried that, but it's really interesting. Maybe after this talk, I must try this.
Okay, yeah. So yes, please feel free to try it, and as I said, come up with, I would say, better solutions, because this is like it is we are all contributing to the community. So if you could come up with better solution and share, that would help other developers also.
Okay, let's see again. Is there any questions from? Okay, let's see. There is no more questions again. I think. Uh, so there's still more time, guys, until 2:35. So we still have 5 minutes in here. If you have any questions or compliment or something to say to the speakers, to our incredible speakers here from Indian, that was really far from Indonesia, you can drop
Yes.
it on the chat. So, before this talk, I read your video about you also work on augmented reality and virtual reality. Wow.
Yes. 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 So yes, so thank you for that. Yeah, so I have worked on these technologies in the past. Like I mentioned before, I used Python initially for web apps, and then I moved to mobile apps. So now I've used basically AR for mobile applications, mainly for to create mobile-based apps. But yes, Python is something that I might try also with AR. So there are other frameworks for that as well.
Okay. There is still no more questions again from the attendees.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, let's wait again until 2:35. If there's no questions, then maybe I can close the session. Come on, guys. If you have any questions or something to say to the speakers, you can type it in this chat. Come on, guys. It's really a big chance to make Mr. Karan, that is really far away from India, to doing talks in here at PyCon Indonesia 2021. Okay, let's see again. Oh, there's a questions from Irfan Putra. Wait, I will type it in here. Can we orchestra Chaos Toolkit between applications?
Okay, so that, yeah, that's a good question actually. So thanks for that. So yes, you can. That is where you could leverage, as I said, Docker, and I would say that Docker Kubernetes, or something like a CI/CD pipeline. So you can definitely orchestrate. So you will need to basically plan in such a way that once you try to run the experiment, it should be basically you can define a kind of a set of stages where you could first try to run the server, check for the steady state hypothesis whether everything is fine, and then start running individual experiments to basically orchestrate, to check if every endpoint of yours is working as expected or not, and then try to also introduce some failure or something to check, if the failure also, if it's is able to recover from that or not. So you can define like that based on your requirement, but yes, it is definitely possible between applications, between different applications as well. So yes.
Okay, thank you for the answers, Mr. Karen. So, guys, do you have any questions again, or, or something to say to our speakers? There is, we still have time in here, so if you want to ask something or say something to the speakers, you can type it on the chat. Okay, there is a answer from Irwan Putra for his questions. He says, "Thank you."
Thank you for the question. And definitely we, as we are all in the same community, so definitely we will share our knowledge with each other, so we can work on that. So definitely in future we can work in that way. Yes.
There is also a compliment from Januar. He says, "Very useful talk."
Oh, thank you.
Oh, there is a question again from Irfan Putra.
Okay.
Is there any community to talk about Chaos Toolkit?
Yes, there are many to okay, so specifically Chaos Toolkit, I would say there is no such specifically a community, but again there are so many communities out there who talk about chaos engineering as such, because the main idea over here is chaos engineering. Chaos Toolkit is just, I would say, a toolkit, but then the main idea is how do we apply the principles of chaos engineering. So I have not come across till now like a specific community, but I shall try to find out myself, and if yes, if not, then we could start a new community. Or if there is, I can try to give you the link or something, but as of now I'm not really sure. So
Okay, thank you for the answers, Mr. Karan. So it's already in time. We So thank you for the amazing talk that you already shared to us about the Chaos Toolkit, Mr. Karan. So it really opened our new perspective about the Chaos Toolkit. Me also, I never try it. So maybe after this I will try this out, and it looks really amazing. So what a really awesome session, Mr. Karan. Unfortunately, we ran out of time now. So
okay,
thank you so much, Mr. Karan,
thank you.
and also for all of you who already participate in this session. Allow me to close this session and see you soon in the other sessions. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Mr. Karan. Namaste.
Namaste. Yes. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.